In 2018, while touring Alaska, my wife and I decided to take a scenic flight with Talkeetna Air Taxi to see the southern side of Denali Mountain, the highest peak in North America, and its surrounding lower peaks. The flight also included a landing on Ruth Glacier and the Don Sheldon Amphitheater. This short film attempts to capture some of the incredible beauty that we experienced in that magnificent flight. We arrived bright and early the morning of the flight. However, due to a low cloud layer up in the mountain peaks, we were told the flight would be delayed until later on in the afternoon. So after going out ATVing for several hours, we headed back to the Talkeetna airport later in the afternoon, where we learned the weather in the mountains had improved and that the flight was on. After putting on some booties necessary for walking on the glacier, we assembled with about a dozen other tourists in front of the turbine to Haviland Otter aircraft that we would be flying in. After reading off our names, our pilot asked if any one of us was interested in being the co-pilot. Having just earned my commercial pilot certificate just a few weeks earlier, my hand shot up with me voicing my recent accomplishment. The pilot saw the excitement and earnest desire in my face and said, "All right, you got the right seat in the cockpit." So with that, we loaded up the aircraft, the pilot spun up the engine, and we taxied to runway 1. After making his call for departure, our pilot lined up on the runway centerline and pushed the throttle full forward. The sound of the turbine engine crescendoed upward with muted whine as the prop RPMs increased. We slowly began to roll and accelerate down the runway, and a few seconds later we were airborne and climbing, flying northwest over the Talkeetna and Susitna rivers. In the distance, the Alaska Range and Denali Mountain, standing 20,310 feet tall, shone brightly against the deep blue sky. Within just 10 minutes, we were flying over the toe of the Ruth Glacier, with the dark rock debris terminus and moraine standing center in it, and the lateral moraines forming the sides of the massive wide glacier. And as our aircraft gained altitude, so did the glacier winding upwards in the direction of Denali. As we continued to ascend upwards, deep turquoise blue pools of ice melt speckled the surface of the otherwise white glacier surface. Minutes later, we were passing towering solid granite rock formations that rose nearly 5,000 feet up from the base of Ruth Glacier. The snow-capped granite spires stood like giant frozen sentinels guarding the gates of Denali Mountain and its neighboring lower peaks, Moose's Tooth, Mount Silverthrone, Mount Huntington, Mount Foraker, and Mount Hunter. The sight was just breathtaking against the cobalt blue sky above and behind the peaks. A short time later, we made a long sweeping turn towards the west, still climbing. As we rolled out of the turn, the nose of the aircraft was facing a massive open snow-covered ice field surrounded by sharp mountain peaks, and Denali towered off to the right. Named after the famous glacier pilot from Talkeetna, Don Sheldon, we were entering the Don Sheldon Amphitheater area. Though we were still climbing in altitude, I could see our pilot was beginning to make his approach to land on the glacier below and ahead of us. As the Ruth Glacier head rose in front of the aircraft's windscreen, the growing enormity of the scenery in front of my eyes was overwhelming. We were about to land on what could only be described as a sacred place. Between the towering, snow-capped, sheer black granite mountain spires nearly encompassing us on all sides, and the deep, dark blue sky framing them, it seemed we were entering the gates of heaven. The aircraft skis touched down on the glacier with an incredible smoothness, due in part from our skilled pilot, but also with help from the summer afternoon sun that had softened the surface of the snow on the massive glacier head. After our pilot had shut down the aircraft's engine, we exited the plane and stepped out into what seemed like another planet. The surface of the glacier was fairly firm. We sunk only a few inches into the snow as we stepped off the plane's ladder. The sun shone brightly and the sky was a spectacular dark blue, like we were on the precipice of space, as if we were at an altitude much higher than what we were really at. Surprisingly, there was no wind. As we walked around the airplane, the only sound we heard was the occasional rumble of ice tumbling down and crashing at the base of the nearby mountain cliffs. After what seemed like only a couple of minutes, but more like 15 to 20, We took in one last look and breath of the surrounding beauty and air and reboarded our plane. Moments later, our aircraft's prop was maximum RPM and its skis were racing across the snow as we made our takeoff descent down the glacier's head. A few seconds later, we were airborne again, with Ruth Glacier falling away from us as we gained altitude and headed back toward Talkeetna. The flight back was just as spectacular, with the sheer knife-edge mountains appearing to be just an arm's length away from us as we twisted and turned our way around massive rock walls and canyons, heading southeast and descending downwards over Ruth Glacier and back into the Talkeetna River Valley area. In less than 30 minutes, we were touching down at Talkeetna Airport. As we taxied, I looked back from the cockpit into the main cabin area of the plane. To a person, everyone was sitting silent. Each appeared to be still, mesmerized by the beauty and serenity that they had just experienced in the Alaska range. Of all my trips and adventures in Alaska and elsewhere around the world, that flight still stands out by far at the top of my list of the most incredible experiences I've ever had in my life. One cannot walk away from that raw, natural beauty and believe that there is not a greater power of being out there to create such a wonder. Suffice it to say, I would highly recommend anyone that makes it to Alaska to take one of these flights seeing adventures to Denali. Yes, there is some risk, as there is with anything in life worth doing, but that risk is extremely low and the reward is tremendously high. The operators that fly out of Talkeetna have incredibly experienced pilots and crew that make safety their number one priority, and they fly aircraft that are ideally suited for the unique and extreme environments they operate in. So again, if you get the chance to go to Alaska, make sure you check out one of these flight seeing adventures. It'll definitely be worth your while and a trip of your lifetime.